Okay, this video is looking at planning a training year. This is also called periodization, and this is our second dot point for the critical question, what are the planning considerations for improving performance? Our syllabus for this dot point says that you need to know the phases of competition. That includes pre-season, in-season, and off-season phases. You need to know the sub-phases, both macro and micro cycles, and I'm also going to talk about mesocycles in this video. We need to talk about peaking, we need to talk about tapering, and these two really go together. And we're going to also have a look at some sport-specific sub-phases, including the fitness components and skill requirements of specific sports. Now, because there's a Learn To go with this Learn About, so our Learn To here asks you to develop and justify a periodization chart of the fitness and skill-specific requirements of a particular sport. So you have to look at a particular sport and basically plan out a whole training year. A periodization is the process where you break down a training year into smaller time segments in order to better structure your training. Now, periodization has a number of purposes, okay? So people do it in order to monitor and adjust training volume and intensity. We're looking to optimize performance at the right time, so that peaking, we're gonna get to that again. And also to make sure that we avoid overtraining and undertraining. Now, it's very important here that you remember that periodization really helps to avoid overtraining. Okay, that's one of the main reasons why people use periodization, but also it's going to help to make sure that we peak at the right times for our specific competitions and events. Now, there are three phases of competition that you need to know, and they have different names. So I'm going to use both names here. So there's the pre-season, which is also known as the preparation phase. There's in-season, which is also known as the competition phase. And of course, there's the off-season, which is the transition phase. Now, during pre-season, we have some general and specific time periods. So often pre-season or this preparation phase, depending on how long it is, will be separated into two separate what's called mesocycles. Okay, and so we're going to break this up. During pre-season for, let's say, rugby league, soccer, where you have big seasons, they have general and specific phases. For ones that are a bit more clustered all over the place, this will vary in their length and times and stuff according to the schedule of events, essentially. So during our general mesocycle in our pre-season phase, we're looking at health-related components of fitness. So all these different fitness requirements that are needed for your sport. So that's your muscular strength, that's your cardiovascular fitness, it's your muscular endurance, that's your flexibility. All those kinds of things about your fitness are going to be done in your general pre-season phase. You might start to develop some technique stuff and probably do some biomechanics, more the analysis stage, and then you do your adjusting as you go through the pre-season. You will then transition from the general into the specific phase of our pre-season. And during our specific phase, we're starting to look at our skills-based components of fitness. So we're looking at agility, power, we're looking at speed, all those extra bits that might be needed specifically for a specific sport. Okay, and of course, you're going to make sure you're focusing on the ones that are needed for your sport. So if it's AFL, for example, they need to be very cardiovascularly fit. They need to have good muscular endurance. They should have some pretty good speed, but they're not going to be looking so much for making sure that the athlete is overly flexible. Whereas for gymnastics, they might make sure the athlete is very flexible, very strong, but not need as much cardiovascular fitness. Okay, so we're making sure that we're being specific the whole way through. We're going to really look to develop skills, tactics, and strategy during this time. So we're going to introduce it and get people to really get some basic ideas of what they're doing when we then come to the in-season. And we're going to introduce all of our mental skills and make sure that athlete is ready to start using some psychological strategies when they get out into competition. During our in-season phase, we're really going to make sure that the skill is perfected. So we've done our biomechanical analysis of it, we've started to develop it, and now we're just making sure it is really refined, and that's going to be one of our main focuses. We're going to really focus on tactics and strategy as well, because we're going to constantly have to play against competition, and so we want to make sure that our tactics are correct, and then also look at the opposition and make sure that we have specific strategies as we go and play against them. We want to make sure that we are maintaining our specific fitness for our sport. So make sure that we're not losing anything or that reversibility from our principles of training. We want to make sure that we're not losing that. We also need to continue to work on developing appropriate mental skills, continue to use our psychological strategies during competition. When we shift to the off-season phase, this is our transition phase, And our basic aims are really about physical and mental recovery. So we want to make sure that both our body and our mind is recovered from the sport and that we are generally refreshed. So it might include a holiday, it may not. It will depend on the length of the off season. And it's not an off season. This is definitely not a time when no training happens, but it's a time where the focus is more on refreshing and allowing the body to recover. So for example, if you've just done the Australian Open and you've made it through to the final and you've really hurt your body and you've trained really hard and you've had to participate in competition every couple of days, you then might take a week or two off where you're not doing lots of big training. You might do some cardiovascular fitness or something, and maybe a little bit of skill stuff, but you're not going to be training anywhere near as much as what you were before. And you're going to make sure you include things like, going and getting a massage, sleeping in the morning, making sure that you actually go and spend time with your family. All those types of things get added in more specifically during that off season or that transition phase. Okay, so I do really want to emphasize that this is not a no training phase. So I know it's called off season, but it doesn't mean that the athlete switches off. Okay, this is really a transition phase as we're transitioning from competition to getting ready for pre-season again. We want to make sure that any gains that we've made during and leading up to competition are completely lost, because then we have to start at a lower level. The longer you spend during your off season doing very little or nothing, and that means that you've got to do more work during your pre-season to get yourself back up to your fitness level that you were beforehand. We now move on to our sub-phases. So I've mentioned these already within periodization. So there's our macro cycle, which is normally your full 1 year or possibly more than 1 year. So for example, if you're trying to make sure you peak at the Olympics, that's a 4-year mesocycle. A 4-year macro cycle. We'll then break that down into smaller phases, which are going to be called mesocycles, and they are normally 1 to 2 months is going to be a mesocycle. It can be a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, but just remember these are rough guides. And then of course there's your microcycle, and your microcycle really is about a week. It can go up to maybe 10 days, but you're really looking at your weekly competition type seasons and those kinds of competitions. So for your microcycles, they're what you're going to do between your game that you had on Friday and the next game you're going to have on the next weekend, and making sure that you're doing proper recovery, training that happens, focusing on whatever needs to be focused on, some kind of peaking happening so that you're ready for the weekend, so that you're going to play at your best again for that next period of time. So macro cycle 1 year plus, mesocycle short, maybe 1 to 2 months, and then your microcycle are your week-to-week training sessions. When we come to peaking, peaking is really about the athlete performing at their absolute best for competition. It only really can be temporarily reached, and it only really during the most important parts of competition. So you want to make sure the athlete is peaking when they need to, okay? And we're talking their best physical condition, their best mental condition, their best execution of their skills, their best ability to fit into the tactics and strategies of the team, and all those things. And so there are athletes who will not have peaked, but still be able to perform a lot better than a lot of other athletes, but they want to still make sure that they're peaking for those major periods of time. So it might be when they get to the World Cup, you want to make sure the athlete is peaking. It might be when they go to the US Open that you want your tennis player to be peaking. But particularly within the tennis, even within that, you want to make sure they're peaking for the grand final. You want to make sure that your athlete is not peaking at the beginning of the competition phase and then they then lose that during competition because they can't maintain it for the whole period of competition. It becomes really vital too for those longer periods of competition, because your athletes, they're not going to peak the whole time. They need to kind of get to a point where they can kind of maintain it and then make sure that they peak really around that grand final stage or towards the end of competition. Or maybe even if there aren't grand finals in the sport, they might want to peak when they're playing against particular oppositions. So for example, if you're playing for someone like Liverpool and you have to come up against Chelsea, you might want to make sure that your athletes are peaking when they play Chelsea, but not necessarily when they're playing against West Brom or something. There are some indicators as well for whether or not an athlete has peaked. So we're looking at someone who is at a state of excellent health. They have a heightened rate of recovery from training, so they're really recovering quite quickly. Their body systems, particularly the circulatory and respiratory systems, their muscular and energy systems, are really tuned for optimal functioning. They are really going at the top level. You're looking at adjustments in technical and tactical preparations are completed and they're all ready to go. And they have superior neuromuscular coordination. So like all their skills, tactics, their ability to read plays, etc. That's all as good as it gets for peaking. There's also some social and psychological indicators. So peaking is not just about your body, it's about your mind too. And so here we have people who are heightened self-confidence and motivation. So they're really focused, really motivated, and know they can do stuff. They have an ability to tolerate higher levels of frustration and react positively to practices that simulate the competition environment. So that might be, trash talks where things go wrong, a call goes against them. Those types of things they need to be able to respond to positively. And so a peaking athlete will make sure that they do that. And they also are at a state of mental alertness and readiness for action. They're always ready, always wanting to get out and just enjoy playing and performing. They're really at their peak. Now, in order to get to peaking, you have to use tapering, because concentrated training where you're increasing volumes and increasing intensities, that's going to reduce your strength, it's going to reduce your power, it's going to reduce your performance. And so tapering is really a period of about 2 to 4 weeks where you're going to cut back on your volume of training. Okay, normally you'll try and maintain the intensity of training, but you're going to cut back that volume. So rather than training, at high intensities 4 days a week, you're now only going to do that 2, maybe 3 days a week to allow for a better recovery and longer periods of recovery, particularly leading into that event. So a rugby league player team, for example, will often not train on a Thursday night if they've got a game on a Friday, because that's going to mean that they're actually still recovering. Okay, and so we need to make sure that we're tapering. We're going to reduce the volume of training, reduce the volume of work that's involved in training, while trying to still maintain intensity, because intensity actually will help maintain the athlete's level of performance a lot more than volume will. Now, there's a nice little chart here, and this chart really looks at, so in your preparation phase, you're going to increase your volume of training. Once it gets up to competition, particularly the end here you can see of competition, that's when we're going to start to taper. So you can see the volume of training goes down, but our performance is going to go up. Because we're now allowing our athlete to fully recover, their glycogen stores are full, their small tears in their muscles have recovered, all those small little niggling injuries that they may have had are going to recover during this phase to make sure that they are really ready to peak for that performance. Now, sport-specific subphases is our last little dash point for this dot point. These include the different fitness components and skill components that are required for the sport, and when they're going to be focused on for training. So if you think back to that big chart that I had, I've chosen when I'm going to focus on the different things. So when I'm going to focus on cardiovascular fitness, when I'm going to focus on muscular endurance, strength, power, flexibility, etc. When am I going to focus on these things? That's all about the sport-specific subphases. So when am I going to break that down and go, okay, this is my focus during this big part of my macro cycle. So this focus is normally done in meso or micro cycles. So you'll notice in that big chart, during the pre-season, we're going to develop strength, and only really during the general part of the pre-season. So we're looking at about a month there, that's a mesocycle, and then they'll get broken down into weeks where we might focus on particular areas of that athlete and really developing and growing that. So those macro mesocycles, those sport-specific subphases, are really about when are you focusing on particular components of fitness or other things like skills that are related to your sport.